The rise of totalitarianism in Europe, 1924 to 1942. We began the course with a discussion of modernity. The earliest 20th century witnessed the death of the old Europe and the rise of a new Europe. World War I brought about the final destruction of traditional Europe. The old dynastic states were gone. The Habsburgs, gone. Hohenzollerns, gone. Romanovs, gone. Ottomans, gone. Royal families that had ruled Europe for hundreds of years suddenly found themselves without a throne. In their place, Europeans turned to republics. Republics rest on popular sovereignty. Now, that popular sovereignty could exert itself through elections, as there were in France, or they could exert themselves through the military. In Western Europe, the republics, by and large, rested upon elections, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of worship, freedom of assembly. On the other hand, Eastern Europe, from the Bolsheviks down to Kemal Ataturk's Turkey, they rested upon military might, that the military would protect the popular will against foreign and domestic enemies. When the Depression hit in the late 1920s, the Depression put considerable pressure on Western republics. Representative governments had to navigate the difficult decisions of the economic depression. They had to navigate and alleviate the real pain and suffering of millions of people facing unemployment and homelessness. They also had to deal with dissent. How does a representative government deal with millions of people who are crying out for change? In this atmosphere, demagogues offered an alternative to totalitarianism. Totalitarianism was a 20th century phenomenon, a social system which attempts to control the daily lives of individuals. In the past, authoritarian governments were able to control vast social institutions, broad social institutions. In the 20th century, totalitarian dictators controlled individuals. They reached into people's homes. Their basis of organization was militarization, to treat every person in society as a part of the military. The military values obedience and violence. Millions of soldiers had experienced World War I. They longed for the camaraderie and the mission and the purpose in the military. In democratic societies, decision-making is messy. In military societies, decision-making is easy. There's a commander. In totalitarian societies, the demagogue presented himself as a mystical leader. Unlike an ordinary politician who bickers and squabbles, the mystical leader would rise above and implement the will of the people directly, against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This type of leadership was made possible by the mass media and industrialized warfare. The mass media allowed the mystical leader to influence behavior. New technology, such as the industrialized printing press, allowed that mystical leader to deliver a message into the homes and cafes across Europe on a daily basis. Augmenting that influence of the newspaper was access to radio. Mystical leaders often spoke directly to their populations. For the first time in world history, individuals could hear their leader directly in their homes. Families would gather around in their homes and listen to the voice of their leader. Much more deadly was the power of industrialized warfare. This image of the Boston Massacre helps illustrate the qualitative and quantitative difference between 100 years earlier, 1800, and just 100 years later, 1920s. In this image, we see a group of red coats on the right and angry Bostonians on the left. The Bostonians are protesting the redcoats. The protesters get out of hand. They throw snowballs. with rocks at the redcoats. The redcoats then opened fire. Paul Revere famously captured that in his sketch on the Boston Massacre. By using the word massacre, Paul Revere wanted to invoke a feeling of mass death. But in reality, it was less than a handful of people who died. Contrast that what happened at Tiananmen Square. This picture of the tank man who stood in front of the tank rapidly spread around the world. When the tank moved, he moved. Every time the tank moved, he moved. That tank driver could have easily run over him. Not only him, but the tank driver could have run over thousands of people, as long as they stood in the way. When a totalitarian leader gives an order, and the military follows through with that order, thousands and millions can die. Later on, when the cameras were off, the communist leaders cleared out Tiananmen Square. And there was really nothing the protesters could do because the military was willing to shoot anyone who dissented. 20th century demagogues had at their disposal the tools to reach into the homes and influence the behavior of millions, and those that were not convinced to follow were killed. Millions of people across Europe lost their lives because their fellow compatriots believed that they were enemies of the people. Not all totalitarian leaders were the same ideologically. Their behavior was similar, but the way they thought about the world and approached the world was radically different. There are two sides to the political spectrum. There's the left side and the right side. On the left side of the political spectrum, individuals look for new ideas. On the right side of the political spectrum, individuals look for old ideas. Left, new; right, old. The words for these tendencies come from the early 19th century. Words that come from a response to the French Revolution. On the left, then, are liberals. Liberals favored individual liberty. Liberals were individuals who were in favor of the French Revolution. They were in favor of overthrowing the monarchy, favor of disestablishing the church, in favor of tearing down economic regulations. These were 19th century liberals. On the other side of the political spectrum were conservatives. Conservatives wanted to preserve the traditional order. Conservatives fought against liberals. Conservatives wanted to protect the monarchy. Conservatives wanted to protect the church. Conservatives wanted to protect economic monopolies. So in the 19th century, these words evolved, and they continue to evolve throughout the 19th century until the 20th century takes on a little bit different meanings. But they still have the same basic ideological intent. Liberals prefer something new. Conservatives prefer something old. In the middle of conservatives and liberals were moderates. Moderates would take a little bit from the new, take a little bit from the old. On the far left of the political spectrum were radicals. Radicals wanted to tear down anything old in society and replace it with something completely new. Radicals were willing to experiment. Radicals wanted to completely destroy all of the old institutions that supported the church, the property, the hierarchy of society, and level it. On the other hand, reactionaries on the far right. Reactionaries wanted to tear out anything that was new in society. They blamed society's problems on the innovation. And so they preferred to bolster hierarchical institutions. They preferred to clamp down on individual liberty. Radicals on the far left, reactionaries on the far right. Totalitarianism appeared both on the far left and the far right of the political spectrum. They were polar opposites in their thinking. In the middle, then, European governments turned towards republics. Republics allowed liberals and conservatives to talk about their problems, debate their issues, mobilize their supporters. Whomever won the election gained political power and implemented their policies. Radicals and reactionaries challenged the legitimacy of republics. On the far left, communism developed as the most vocal and successful challenge to republics. Communists followed the ideas of Karl Marx. Now, all communists are Marxists, but not all Marxists are communist. Communism refers to a 20th century totalitarian movement. Marxism is much broader, a base of intellectual thinking. But communism rested its ideology on Marxism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were materialists. They denied spiritual reality. And so when the communists took over countries, when the communists advocated policies, they wanted to tear down churches and rip up spiritual institutions. They saw spiritual institutions as detrimental to society because those spiritual institutions helped maintain suffering in this world. Karl Marx famously said, religion was an opium of the masses, that political leaders, church leaders, used religion to dull this world's pain. The opium of religion would dull this world's economic pains and prevent real social change. Marx and Engels then advocated a workers' revolution. In the popular mind, that meant a violent revolution. And so the communists advocated a violent overthrow of society. Once they succeeded, they would implement socialism. Socialism meant public ownership of property. For the communists, that meant state control of all land, state control of all factories, state control of all railroads, state control of all banks. So, all communists are socialist, but not all socialists are communist. Communists had a very specific understanding of socialism. The example we're going to examine is Stalin's USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Joseph Stalin was a communist. He was a Marxist. He was a materialist. He favored a workers' revolution. He favored socialism. His method for achieving those goals was totalitarianism. He used the mass media and industrialized warfare to get his way. On the other extreme of the political spectrum was fascism. The fascists focus on a community's heritage. This makes it much more difficult to identify fascists by the words they use, because they each look to a particular golden age in their community's past and elevate that as the most successful time and a time that needed to be emulated. What this means, though, is that fascists, by and large, are xenophobic. They identify alien elements both within the community and outside of the community as scapegoats for social problems. So on the positive side, fascists will simply talk about the virtues of their particular community as it being superior to others. But on the negative side, that manifests itself in attacks on immigrants and people who do not support the community's religion or economic or political outlook. Fascists then turn to support from traditional spiritual leaders within the community. The fascists will point to the communists and say, look, those communists over there are coming to get you. They want to tear down your churches. They want to close your places of worship. They want to take away your right to prayer. Come, surrender your individual liberty so that the fascist can protect you from those nasty communists on the other side. The fascists promise middle-class stability. So while the communists look to workers to support, the fascists turn to shopkeepers, professionals, small business people, arguing that only a system of law and order could prevent a complete and utter social breakdown. This meant that the fascists supported capitalism, private ownership of property. The fascists promised the property owners to protect them from the communists. The communists were organizing into unions. They claimed the communists and the unions were a bunch of thugs who were going to break property, smash windows, all in the name of economic change. The fascists promised a swift and harsh hand to deal with that social unrest. The example we're going to look at is Hitler's Third Reich. Hitler claimed he was resurrecting an ancient German tradition, and that would make Germany great again. Hitler was diametrically opposed to the communist and the socialist. Hitler did not support a republic. Hitler's goal was to rip out all of the novel institutions of the 20th century and return Germany to a period of greatness based on blood and iron. Hopefully you can see that the republics found themselves pinched between the communist on the left and the fascist on the right. The republics had a value based on talk and compromise. The leadership of the republic would talk through their problems, their issues, their disagreement, and reach a compromise. The totalitarian leaders, on the other hand, preferred violence and purity. They would use violence to purify their society. For the communists, that meant ripping out everything old. For the fascists, that meant ripping out everything new. So while their ideologies were diametrically opposed to each other, their behaviors were exactly the same. This introduction then provides the basis for two separate lectures. One lecture on communism, and in it we're going to look at the death and resurrection of Lenin, Soviet purification, and rapid industrialization. The other lecture is a lecture on fascism. We're going to look at the movement from the Weimar Republic to Adolf Hitler. We're going to look at the Nazi rise to power, how the Nazis used democratic institutions, republican institutions, to kill the Republic. Once they were successful with killing the Republic, they established a Third Reich, a totalitarian system. So here are two examples, one on the far left, one on the far right. Their behaviors fit into the general pattern of totalitarianism, but on each side they were motivated by a different set of ideas. So here are two men, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler. They diametrically opposed each other ideologically, but their behaviors were mirror images of each other.